Welcome to Life Stories, where real experiences and deep emotions come together to tell tales that resonate with the heart. Today, we share a powerful journey of a father and daughter navigating the dark aftermath of betrayal and finding the strength to rebuild their bond. Through moments of fear, love, and resilience, this story reminds us of the incredible power of protection and healing. Join us as we explore the painful yet hopeful path of a family learning to heal and grow stronger together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story with us. It was a cold, overcast morning when my world started to crumble. I was sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring my coffee, when Sophie, my 7-year-old daughter, walked in. Her usual exuberance seemed dampened, as though the weight of something heavy was resting on her tiny shoulders. Her small hands twisted around the fabric of her shirt as she approached me. Her big blue eyes wide with something I couldn't quite name. "Dad," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to make my heart skip a beat. "I need to tell you something." At first, I thought it was just a child's silly concern. The kind of innocent misinterpretation I had grown used to in the years since Rachel, my wife, had passed away. Sophie had always been sensitive. Perhaps too sensitive for someone her age. She often noticed things that went unnoticed by others, like the way I would linger too long by Rachel's old photo or the way the house always seemed to echo with her absence. But even with that awareness, I couldn't have prepared myself for what Sophie was about to say. "Dad, Sarah, she scares me." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice betrayed the concern that was beginning to rise inside me. Sophie fidgeted, her eyes lowering as she hesitated. When you're not here, she says things, bad things. She gets mad when I don't listen. And, sometimes, she hurts me." The words hung in the air, each one falling like a weight on my chest. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The room seemed to grow smaller, the space between us filling with unspoken fear. Sarah, my fiancée, the woman I had begun to believe could bring light back into our lives, was supposed to be the one who would make things easier for us, not harder. The idea that she could be causing Sophie any harm was unfathomable. At first, I dismissed it as a child's misunderstanding, as I often did when Sophie said things that didn't quite make sense. I told myself that Sophie had simply been upset or confused. Maybe she felt neglected. Maybe she just didn't like sharing me with someone else. After all, Sarah and I had only recently started to build a life together, and this adjustment had been difficult for all of us. But Sophie's words haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. That perhaps this wasn't just a harmless misunderstanding after all. And so, I decided to pay closer attention, to watch Sarah's interactions with Sophie when I wasn't around. It didn't take long for the cracks to start showing. For weeks, Sarah had been the perfect partner, supportive, kind, and attentive. She would often visit us, bringing small gifts for Sophie, trying to engage her in conversation, and offering her sweet, encouraging smiles. But every time I looked at Sophie, I saw something I couldn't quite place, something in her eyes that was distant, guarded. I would ask her how her day had gone, and she would give me short, evasive answers, as though she were reluctant to share what had really happened. The change was subtle at first. Sophie wasn't the cheerful little girl she once was. She became more withdrawn, spending hours in her room, drawing quietly or playing by herself. And when Sarah came around, it was like the light inside her dimmed even further. But Sophie never outright complained. She never said anything more about Sarah's behavior. And every time I asked her if she was okay, she would smile faintly and assure me that everything was fine. Still, I noticed the small things. How Sophie would flinch when Sarah raised her voice. How she would shrink away when Sarah tried to touch her. There were moments when I'd catch Sophie staring at the floor, avoiding Sarah's gaze as if she were afraid of something. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Sarah, smiling as usual, said something to Sophie in the kitchen, her tone sharp, too sharp for my liking. I couldn't make out the exact words, but the way Sophie stiffened and lowered her head told me everything I needed to know. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Sarah spoke to her. something that didn't sit right with me. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to believe that Sarah, the woman I was falling for, could truly be capable of hurting Sophie. I wanted to believe in the good in people, to believe that I had made the right choice in bringing her into our lives. Maybe it was my own loneliness, my own desire for companionship, that made me blind to the truth. It wasn't until Sophie came to me, her eyes wide with fear, that I began to understand the gravity of the situation. She had tried so hard to keep her feelings hidden, to protect me from the pain of knowing what was happening behind closed doors. But one night, in a moment of overwhelming fear, she finally opened up to me, her voice shaking as she told me what Sarah had said, the threats, the anger, the cruelty. "Dad," Sophie whispered, her small hand gripping mine as if she were afraid I would disappear. She said if I didn't listen to her, she would lock me in the closet. She said no one would believe me, because I'm just a kid. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't fathom how I had let this happen. How had I allowed someone I trusted to hurt my daughter? For the first time, I truly looked at Sophie, not just as my daughter, but as someone who had suffered in silence for far too long. Her wide eyes, filled with fear and uncertainty, broke something inside of me. I had failed her, but I promised myself that night, as I held her tightly in my arms, that I would fix this. I would protect her, no matter the cost. The moment I made that promise to Sophie, everything changed. There was no going back. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what Sophie had told me. The image of her small, trembling body, her eyes filled with fear, stayed with me long after she had fallen asleep in my arms. It was clear now that this wasn't just some misunderstanding, something was wrong. And I had to find out exactly what. I didn't know what to do next. Confronting Sarah head-on seemed impossible. Too rash. What if Sophie had misunderstood? What if I was wrong about Sarah? My mind was a whirlwind of doubt and guilt. I loved Sarah. I believed in her. She was kind, supportive, everything I had hoped for in a partner. But the evidence was mounting, and I couldn't ignore Sophie's distress. I decided that the only way I could get to the truth was to observe. To watch and listen closely without anyone knowing. I had to be certain. Because if I confronted Sarah and I was wrong, I would never forgive myself. But if Sophie was right, I would need to act swiftly. I had no time to waste. Sarah and I had been spending more time together, trying to make things work. And I wanted to believe that Sophie was simply struggling with the changes in our lives. But each time I saw Sarah interact with Sophie, I began noticing the little things. The way Sophie would pull away when Sarah reached out to touch her. Or how she would avoid looking at Sarah's face when they spoke. It wasn't like Sophie. She was normally a curious, talkative little girl, always seeking attention and affection. But now, she seemed to shrink whenever Sarah entered the room. I didn't tell Sarah about my concerns. I didn't want to make it worse, to turn her against Sophie before I had concrete proof. Instead, I started to keep a careful eye on them both when I wasn't around. It wasn't easy. There were only so many ways I could sneak around without raising suspicion. But I had to know. The opportunity to act came one afternoon when I decided to take a short trip to the grocery store. Sarah was visiting for the day, and I knew Sophie would be home. I was careful as I left, trying to act as normal as possible. But instead of going to the store, I parked a few blocks away and walked back to the house, trying to be as quiet as I could. When I returned, I made my way to the kitchen and then, as quietly as I could, tiptoed upstairs to Sophie's room. I had to be careful. If I was caught, everything would fall apart. My heart was racing as I crouched down, hiding in the dark, cramped closet of Sophie's room. I could barely breathe, but I told myself it was necessary. If I was going to protect her, I needed to know what was really happening. The silence in the house was unnerving. I could hear footsteps in the living room as Sarah moved about. But there were no sounds of Sophie's footsteps. I held my breath, praying that I wouldn't be discovered. Moments later, I heard Sarah's voice. She wasn't speaking loudly, but the tone was sharp and cold, as if she were trying to control the situation. I leaned forward, my hands gripping my phone tightly, ready to record whatever happened next. "Don't you think it's time you stopped annoying me?" Sarah's voice came, low and menacing. I could hear the impatience in her tone. A sharp contrast to the warmth and care she usually displayed. You're getting on my nerves. Sophie, you're not a baby anymore. I froze. I had never heard Sarah speak like this before. My heart sank. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them. It was as if Sophie was nothing more than an inconvenience to her. I pressed the record button. Desperate to capture everything. My stomach churned with the realization that Sophie's words had been true. This wasn't just about a child's adjustment to a new family member. This was something far darker. Sophie didn't answer at first. I could hear her breathing. Shallow and nervous. And I knew she was afraid. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. And I realized that Sarah was approaching Sophie's bed. What's the matter with you? Sarah snapped, her voice dripping with frustration. If you can't behave, I'll lock you in the closet. Maybe you'll learn some respect then. My body went cold at her words. I wanted to jump out of the closet and confront her right then and there. But I held myself back. I had to be sure. I reminded myself. I couldn't act impulsively. The door to Sophie's room creaked open. And I could hear the sound of Sarah's heels clicking against the floor. She was standing over Sophie now. And I could hear the tension in the room. Thick and suffocating. Do you understand me? Sarah asked. There was no warmth in her voice. No care. Only control. And something much darker. I heard Sophie's voice. Barely a whisper. Yes. I could feel my heart breaking as I watched the scene unfold. Knowing that I couldn't protect Sophie the way I wanted to. But this wasn't the end. No. It was just the beginning. I stayed hidden in that closet for what felt like an eternity. Unable to move. Unable to breathe. Every moment felt heavier than the last. But I knew I couldn't leave. I had to gather all the proof I needed before I could confront Sarah. If I didn't, Sophie's suffering would continue. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that I had to make a choice. I had to protect Sophie. No matter what it took. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered in that dark closet. When the sounds faded and Sarah's footsteps left the room, I finally allowed myself to exhale. My heart was still pounding. But I knew it wasn't over. I had seen enough to know that Sophie wasn't lying. The moments that followed were a blur. My hands trembled as I replayed the recording on my phone, listening again to Sarah's cold, calculated words. My chest tightened with each passing second, as if the weight of the truth was slowly suffocating me. I had trusted Sarah. I had believed that she could be a positive force in Sophie's life. And now, I had the undeniable evidence that my trust had been shattered. I sat in that closet, alone, for what felt like an eternity. The air thick with anger and disbelief. It took everything in me to keep my emotions in check. I wanted to confront Sarah right then and there. To scream at her. To demand answers. But I knew that doing so without knowing the full extent of her actions would only put Sophie in more danger. I had to be careful. After some time, I finally emerged from the closet. My legs stiff from sitting in such an uncomfortable position for so long. I had seen enough. I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. I needed to protect Sophie, and that meant I had to face Sarah head on. I didn't know what I was going to say when I confronted her. I had no idea how to process everything I had just learned. But one thing was certain. I could no longer ignore the truth. Sarah had to leave. When I returned to the living room, Sarah was sitting on the couch, smiling as if nothing was wrong. She was speaking to Sophie, trying to engage her in conversation. But Sophie wasn't responding. She kept her head down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was so small, so fragile, and I hated the fact that I had let this happen. I walked past them without saying a word, my mind racing. I went to the kitchen and stood there for a moment, my hands gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to gather my thoughts. I could feel the weight of the decision I had to make pressing down on me. But there was no turning back. I couldn't allow Sarah to stay in our home. Not after what I had just heard. Not after what I had just witnessed. I could hear Sarah's voice in the next room. Cheerful as ever. But it was like a mask. A facade she was putting on to hide the person she really was. The woman I thought I knew. The woman I had been falling in love with. I took a deep breath and turned to face her. She was still sitting on the couch. oblivious to what I had just discovered. I couldn't believe how normal she looked. How effortless it seemed for her to slip into her role as my partner. But I knew better now. I knew who she really was. Sarah, I said, my voice surprisingly calm. I surprised myself with how controlled I sounded, considering the fury bubbling beneath the surface. We need to talk. Her eyes flickered with confusion. But she smiled as she always did. A smile that now felt more like a mask than a genuine expression. Of course, Jack. What's on your mind? I swallowed hard, trying to keep my emotions in check. I couldn't let her see how devastated I was. I couldn't let her see the anger and hurt that were threatening to consume me. I know what you've been doing to Sophie, I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. Her smile faltered for just a moment. And in that instant, I saw the real Sarah. The one I had been blind to all this time. It was a brief glimpse. But it was enough. What are you talking about? She asked. Her voice suddenly defensive. But she didn't meet my eyes. I pulled out my phone, holding it out in front of her. I've been recording you, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I know everything. Sarah's face went pale as she looked at the phone in my hand. Her breath caught in her throat. And for a split second, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. She composed herself, standing up slowly and brushing her hands over her clothes. Jack, you don't understand, she began, her voice shaking just slightly. It's not what you think. I was just trying to. No, I interrupted, my voice louder now, filled with the weight of everything I had just learned. You were trying to control her. You were trying to break her down. Make her fear you. And I'm not going to let you do that anymore. I took a step forward, my chest heaving with the effort to keep my anger in check. I heard you, Sarah. I heard how you spoke to her. How you threatened her. How you hurt her when I wasn't around. And I'm not going to let you do it again. She took a step back, her face reddening with a mixture of frustration and fear. She looked like she was about to cry. But I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. Not after what I had just heard. Not after what she had done to Sophie. Jack, please, Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking. I never meant to hurt anyone. I was just trying to discipline her. She's a spoiled little girl. And don't you dare make excuses for your behavior, I said, my voice now a low growl. You have no right to treat her that way. No right. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. But I didn't care. I had seen enough. I knew enough. You need to leave, I said, my words final. Now. She opened her mouth to protest. But I couldn't hear it anymore. I turned and walked toward the door, my heart heavy with the weight of everything I had just uncovered. I wasn't just losing a partner, I was losing someone I had trusted. But I couldn't let that cloud my judgment. Sophie needed me, and I had to do whatever it took to protect her. As Sarah gathered her things and left, I could feel the storm inside me raging. But there was also a sense of relief. I had made the right choice. Sophie was safe now, and no one would ever hurt her again. The door slammed shut behind Sarah, the sound echoing through the empty house, marking the final moment of her presence in our lives. I didn't look back as she walked out. I didn't need to. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I could hear the soft thud of her suitcase being dropped outside, the sound of her footsteps retreating. But I stayed rooted to the spot. For the first time in what felt like forever. The house was still. There was no cheerful voice from Sarah. No forced smiles. No uncomfortable silence. Just peace. The kind of peace I hadn't felt in months. But the relief was fleeting. As soon as the door closed, my thoughts turned immediately to Sophie. I turned around and found her standing there, just a few feet away, her eyes wide with something I couldn't name. She didn't say a word, but I could see the tension in her small body, the way she was holding herself, as if bracing for something. She had witnessed everything, heard everything. Sophie, I whispered, my voice soft and full of regret. It's over now. You're safe, I promise. But she didn't respond right away. Instead, she lowered her gaze, looking down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. I wanted to take her in my arms, to wrap her up and make everything better. But I knew that wasn't enough. It wasn't that simple. She had been through something that I couldn't undo with words. Dad? Her voice was small, almost inaudible, as if she wasn't sure if she should speak. Is she really gone? I nodded, kneeling down to her level so that I could look her in the eyes. Yes, sweetheart, she's gone. She's never going to hurt you again. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. And without warning, they spilled down her cheeks. The floodgates opened, and her sobs filled the silence. My heart broke into 1,000 pieces as I pulled her into my arms. Holding her as tightly as I could, she clung to me, her small hands gripping my shirt with desperation, as if afraid I would disappear too. I'm sorry, sweetheart, I whispered, pressing my cheek against her hair. I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner. I should have protected you. I didn't know what she was doing. Sophie pulled away slightly, her face streaked with tears. But she didn't say anything. She just looked at me, her eyes searching mine, looking for something I couldn't quite give her in that moment. We're going to be okay now, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You're going to be okay. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you again. Not ever. I knew that it wasn't enough to simply say those words. We had a long road ahead of us. And Sophie's wounds weren't going to heal overnight. But in that moment, I made a vow to myself. I would do whatever it took to make things right. I would help Sophie rebuild the trust that had been shattered. And I would make sure she never felt unsafe again. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. I didn't feel the immediate freedom I had expected after Sarah's departure. Instead, there was an overwhelming silence in the house. A quiet that was both comforting and unsettling. I had always thought that once Sarah was gone, things would return to normal. But normal seemed like a distant memory. Sophie was quieter than usual. And while she still smiled at times, it didn't reach her eyes. I made an appointment for Sophie with a child therapist. I didn't know much about therapy, but I knew that she needed someone to help her work through the trauma. I had tried to be strong for her, to be everything she needed. But I was just one person. I couldn't do this alone. I wasn't equipped to heal the pain she had endured. But together, we could try to rebuild. The first few therapy sessions were difficult. Sophie didn't want to talk much. And when she did, her words were hesitant, unsure. But over time, she began to open up. Slowly, the pieces of her shattered world started to come together. She began to understand that what had happened wasn't her fault. And I began to understand that my job as a father wasn't just to protect her, it was to help her heal. To be patient, and to show her that she could trust me again. I was doing the best I could. But I couldn't help but feel like I had failed her in so many ways. I should have seen the signs. I should have acted sooner. But those thoughts only weighed me down. And I knew I had to push them aside if I was going to help Sophie move forward. Sophie started showing small signs of improvement. She began to talk more, to smile more, and though the darkness that had settled over her still lingered, there were moments, brief moments, when I saw a flicker of the little girl she used to be. I clung to those moments with everything I had, knowing that they were the first signs of healing, of hope. One evening, after dinner, Sophie came up to me as I was sitting on the couch. She didn't say anything at first, but I could feel the weight of her words. I looked up from the newspaper I had been reading, and she took a deep breath before speaking. Dad, she said softly, I'm glad she's gone. My heart swelled with emotion, and I reached out to pull her into my arms once more. It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was the first step toward healing, and I would do everything in my power to make sure it was only the beginning. The days following Sarah's departure felt like a whirlwind. The house was quieter now. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was a heavy kind of quiet. The kind that comes after something awful has happened. And the aftermath still lingers. There were no more forced smiles from Sarah. No more tense conversations in the kitchen. No more tiptoeing around the house trying not to disturb the fragile balance we had once tried to maintain. But the absence of those things didn't immediately feel like relief. It just felt like a gaping hole that nothing could fill. Sophie was still reeling from the impact of everything that had happened. She had moments of happiness. Brief flashes where the light returned to her eyes. But they were fleeting. Most days, she still retreated into herself, spending hours in her room drawing or playing quietly. There were times when she would look at me, And I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. As if she wasn't sure she could trust me. Wasn't sure that she was truly safe. I knew she needed time. But time felt like a luxury I didn't have. I had promised her that things would get better. That we could start anew. But I had no idea how to make that happen. I didn't know where to begin or what the first step even looked like. How do you rebuild trust when it has been broken so profoundly? How do you help your child heal when you, too, are still struggling to make sense of everything? But I was determined to try. I started small, focusing on the things that mattered most, making Sophie feel safe, loved, and heard. I realized that we had been living in survival mode for so long, me trying to fill the gap Rachel had left. Sophie, trying to navigate a world that had suddenly become so unpredictable and frightening. It was time for us to find our rhythm again. To re-establish a sense of stability. Even if it was just in small, everyday moments. One of the first things I did was to create a routine. Something simple, but grounding. I didn't want Sophie to feel like everything around her was chaotic and beyond her control. I started waking up earlier to make her breakfast. Making sure we ate together. Just the two of us. We started watching cartoons in the mornings. A ritual that had once felt trivial but now felt like the only way to begin our days without overwhelming emotions. We also spent more time outdoors. I knew Sophie loved nature. So I took her to the park more often. We went on walks, sat by the lake, and even tried to go bike riding on weekends. At first, Sophie was hesitant, almost too tired to enjoy these activities. But slowly, as we spent more time together, I saw her begin to open up. She would smile a little more, laugh a little louder. It wasn't the same carefree joy she once had. But it was something, and that something was enough to keep me going. One afternoon, I decided to surprise her. I knew how much she loved drawing. And I wanted to give her something to help her feel like herself again. I went to a local art store and bought some new drawing materials, markers, colored pencils, sketch pads, everything I could think of that might spark her creativity. When I came home, I handed them to her. And her eyes widened with surprise. She didn't say anything at first. But I could see the gratitude in her gaze. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. And for the first time in a while, I saw a real smile on her face. It was small, but it was genuine. It was the first time in weeks that I felt like I was doing something right. That night, after dinner, I sat with her at the table while she worked on a drawing. The quiet hum of the house, the sound of her pencil moving across the paper, filled the space between us. There was no pressure, no need for words, just a peaceful, simple moment that felt like progress. But even as I worked to help Sophie heal, I couldn't ignore the growing tension in my chest. There was still something inside me that felt broken, still something unresolved. The guilt that had been gnawing at me from the moment I realized Sarah's true nature hadn't disappeared. I kept asking myself if I had done enough. If I had been there for Sophie the way I should have been. If I had really protected her the way a father should. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo the hurt that had already been done. But I could promise to be there for her now. To be the kind of father she needed. And that was all I could do. As the days turned into weeks, I began to see more of the old Sophie returning. She was still shy, still cautious. But there was a lightness to her that hadn't been there before. She began to talk more. To share her thoughts and feelings. Even if it was just about a drawing she was working on or a new friend she had made at school. She was starting to trust me again. And that was the biggest victory I could ask for. One evening, as we were sitting together on the couch watching a movie, Sophie turned to me and said, "Dad, I think I'm starting to feel better." I smiled, my heart swelling with pride. "I'm so glad to hear that. Sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "We're going to keep getting better. Together, every day." And for the first time in a long while, I truly believed it. We weren't fixed yet, not by a long shot. But we were on our way. And that was enough. In that moment, I realized something important. Healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that everything was okay. It was about learning to move forward. One step at a time. With love, patience, and the unshakable belief that we could rebuild what had been broken. Together. As the weeks turned into months, the healing process was slow. But it was steady. Sophie and I had found a new rhythm. One that was rooted in love, trust, and patience. There were still tough days. Moments when the shadows of the past seemed to creep into our lives. But we faced them together. Stronger than before. Sophie started to laugh again. Truly laugh. Her smile lighting up the room in a way it hadn't in months. She was no longer the withdrawn child who spent hours alone in her room. She was opening up, sharing her thoughts, her dreams, and her fears with me. And every time she did, my heart swelled with pride. I knew that I had failed her in the past. But I was doing everything in my power to make up for it now. The road ahead wasn't easy. We still had a long way to go. And I wasn't naive enough to think that everything would be perfect. But I knew one thing for sure. I would always be there for her. I would never let anyone hurt her again. As we sat together one evening, watching the sunset from our porch, Sophie leaned against me, her small hand in mine. "Dad, thank you for taking care of me," she whispered. I kissed the top of her head, my voice thick with emotion. "I'll always take care of you, sweetheart, always." And in that moment, I realized that the most important lesson life had taught me was the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter. No matter what happened, we would face it together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories. Your support means the world to us.